Welcome, friends, both irradiated and not, to this week's sermon, which is a continual effort to map out the interesting groups of the Commonwealth. This video necessitated that the cartographer go undercover once again to discover as much as possible about the ever-elusive railroad faction, who are in a war of attrition with the Institute. From the intel, the cartographer was able to construct several interesting maps that let us look at the railroad in a way that we never have before. I think the cartographer had a good time, because apparently those railroad types have a more, compassionate view towards all sorts of robots. So crank up the rads while we break out the maps to delve deeper into the railroad. The first map I like to show is where the current locations that are associated with the faction can be found as of the start of the game. There is a lot that goes on during the game, but as of the moment that the Sole Survivor thaws out in 2287, this is the extent to which we know where the railroad is. Now, it's really important to stress this point. Because the railroad's very existence relies on their ability to stay hidden, we don't actually know where all their safe houses and assets can be found. To illustrate this point, Desdemona reveals that the railroad has 12 safe houses by the time the Sole Survivor finds their headquarters under the Old North Church. I interpret that to mean that there are 12 safe houses in addition to their HQ, so 13 established locations in total. But it is possible Des is including the HQ in that count. That doesn't matter a whole lot though, because the number of locations that we know for a fact do belong to the railroad is much lower than that, at only 3. That does make a video like this difficult, but not impossible, and there are actually some really interesting things I found when mapping out the railroad. Although there are 6 locations shown, only 3 of them are real, honest-to-atom locations for the railroad. Those being the Railroad HQ, the Ticonderoga Safe House, and Bunker Hill. Bunker Hill is a special case, but the other locations marked here are Good Neighbor and Diamond City. They are included in this map because these 2 locations are important operational locations that aren't directly under railroad control. We will get more into all this a little bit later. Suffice it to say that the railroad's main holdings are all rather bunched together, and all in Boston proper. I think it makes sense for a group to use the cover of settlements and human habitation to try and hide from the Institute. Of course, if you're around other groups of people and you're trying to hide and blend in, you do run the risk of your enemy also being there, unknown to you, or just normal people accidentally stumbling into a situation where they can expose something. However, I think this is preferential to choosing an extremely isolated location, since those areas, like the extreme north, south, and west parts of the map, do have few people, and any human activity would be deemed suspicious by the Institute. The current Railroad HQ, which lies in the crypt of the Old North Church, marked here by a star, became the group's headquarters in 2287, sometime before the start of the game. There is a good chance that it was a safe house prior to becoming HQ, because the railroad has a pattern of falling back on a safe house when they lose their headquarters. And they had just recently lost the switchboard and fallen back to this location. Now, something I find curious is that one of the ways for the player to uncover the railroad's main base is by following the Freedom Trail. This trail is inspired by a real-life trail, also called the Freedom Trail, that is 2.5 miles long and goes by several important historical locations in Boston. What are the chances that the Sole Survivor would find the railroad at just the right time that their headquarters had been moved to a location that so conveniently lies at the end of the Freedom Trail? Why are they telling people to follow the Freedom Trail to learn more about the railroad when it leads to their HQ, a place that they're trying to keep super secret, and they don't even let a lot of other railroad assets in? It would make more sense to direct people to a location that isn't as important as their headquarters. And don't even get me started on the password to get in. But the church is a direct reference to the real-world Old North Church, which is famous for its role in the Revolutionary War. The crypts serve as the primary base for the railroad for the entire game, where approximately 10 people are found, and should the player side with the Institute or the Brotherhood of Steel, they will need to storm the HQ and kill everyone inside, destroying the entire leadership structure and seemingly ending the railroad. Ticonderoga is a special location because it is the only safe house that we as the player get to see functioning as it should. After completing a quest called Boston After Dark, where the sole survivor helps escort a runaway synth to this safe house, the location is then open for exploration. The safe house is run by someone named Highrise, who is one of the railroad's best assets. This also gives insight into how the railroad is run, since Highrise runs the safe house and is the only one there that communicates directly with HQ. But he also doesn't seem to ever travel there, opting for other methods of communication instead. Ticon, as everyone calls the safe house, is filled with a number of railroad agents and some synths, and appears to be a location where agents can gather and synths can lie low to wait for their chance to escape the Commonwealth. It is stocked with food, drinks, ammunition, and has several beds, but other than the initial escort mission that unlocks the safe house doesn't offer much else to the player. It isn't until later that the player can revisit Ticonderoga in an entirely different mission, but we'll get to that later. Bunker Hill is an interesting case because it operates as a safe house, but it is hidden away underground because the Bunker Hill settlement itself is not allied with the railroad. Bunker Hill is a decent location for synths to come to because of the constant merchant traffic, which presents a great opportunity to move synths undercover. There's only one known permanent railroad asset at Bunker Hill, and he is known as Old Man Stockton. Stockton is the owner of 3 separate merchant caravans and is very important to railroad operations, constantly moving synths in and out of the secret underground safe house. We learn from him that Bunker Hill is every newly escaped synth's first destination in the long process of getting them mind wiped and smuggled out of the Commonwealth. But interestingly, the synths are being directed to Bunker Hill by a member of the Institute. We'll get more into that later, but 4 of the known merchants that consistently travel to and from Bunker Hill are all confirmed Institute informants. So having Bunker Hill be such a vital location is actually really risky, but maybe this is explained by the railroad helper in the Institute, whose codename is Patriot, not being privy to that sort of information. Bunker Hill is also the location for a major plot event known as the Battle for Bunker Hill, which has the Railroad, the Brotherhood, and the Institute all duking it out. The Institute knows of 4 synths that are being harbored there, and want the sole survivor teamed up with a courser to recover those synths. And the Brotherhood wants you to kill the synths since they think they are abominations. The choice is ultimately left up to the player to decide what to do with these synths, since 3 of the main factions all have a vested interest in their fate, and the Minutemen are just off planting potatoes or something. During the battle, we see more railroad agents defending the underground safe house than we have ever seen before, but it isn't clear if they are always stationed here or if they were moved there in preparation of the attack. I don't think that there are always this many railroad agents, because it would make keeping a low profile at Bunker Hill much more difficult, especially with the watching eyes of all the merchants who we know are Institute informants. There don't appear to be any other operations here other than a railroad holotape that can be found in a public area, admonishing people to join the faction, which may or may not have led to an innkeeper at Bunker Hill named Tony Savoldi openly expressing to his father that he wants to join the railroad. Now, here's the lame part, where I have to admit that there are many other safe houses that we don't know the location for, but we do have some details about. Randolph Safe House is one such location, and probably the closest we get to one of these mysterious unknown safe houses. Randolph Safe House is in a questionable state. It has gone dark since they lost their last HQ, and a chalkboard at the new HQ has a question mark next to it, similar to another safe house, Augusta, that we know was destroyed. While working for the railroad, the sole survivor can get a mission to aid the Randolph Safe House, which is run by an agent known as Mr. Timms. The safe house is in tenuous circumstances. They suspect the Institute knows where they are, and they are requesting help. The player receives 6 dead drops in random locations, and Mr. Timms asks for help clearing out a randomly selected location each time. The first location is to clear out some Institute synths that he believes are tracking or looking for them. The rest are a mixture of synths and other wasteland dangers that stand in between Mr. Timms and getting the 3 escaped synths under his watch outside of the Commonwealth. Completing all the missions results in all 3 synths successfully getting out, but we never get to figure out where this safe house is, because Mr. Timms is ordered to shut it down by HQ, citing the near certain probability that the safe house is compromised. The player can later meet Mr. Timms at HQ, where he thanks the sole survivor for the help and sets about finding a new location for the Randolph safe house. In my game, all the locations to go and clear out hostiles were scattered around the map, so there's no way to estimate where the safe house even is. There are 3 more safe houses that we know the name of, but nothing else, and they still seem to be active. Dayton, Stanwix, and Griswold are all apparently still functioning, and although they could be anywhere, it is likely that they are closer to Boston rather than being far flung out into the less populated areas of the map. The large settlements of Goodneighbor and Diamond City are not run or owned by the railroad, but they are important locations where the railroad has a nearly constant presence in some way, and they are critical to the railroad's operations. So while I am showing them on this map, they're kind of a step between the established railroad locations and their operational locations that we see mapped here a little later. So we will look into the details in just a bit. Now we run into the same problem when we want to get a look at what locations, safe houses, and headquarters the railroad used to have, and no longer do before the beginning of the game. We get hints in dialogue, in some terminals, and on the chalkboard at the HQ that mentions some of the major losses the railroad has endured. So yeah, this map here is rather pathetic and needs some explaining. The switchboard is one of the 2 places that we have a known location, which was functioning as the railroad's HQ at the time, but it was sacked. A safe house called Augusta is the other one, located at Kendall Hospital, not too far from the switchboard. This location is easy to stumble upon before meeting the railroad, but if the player doesn't find this place on their own, then Dr. Carrington will task the sole survivor with checking on the Augusta safe house. It was attacked at the same time as the switchboard, and the status is unknown as of the start of the game. Kind of crazy it has taken this long for them to try and figure out what happened, but better late than never, I suppose. Entering the hospital, it becomes clear very quickly that this place is no longer a safe house, as there are railroad bodies strewn about and a really big group of raiders that are in the middle of burning the bodies. I still think it is wild that they're just having a big bonfire in the middle of the building, and they are burning the bodies. How does this not catch the building on fire? How are they not getting smoked out? How are they not repulsed by the smell of the burning bodies? Ah, man. At any rate, there are a truly impressive number of bodies. This must have been a big safe house. One could be forgiven for thinking that the raiders had something to do with the fall of the safe house, but that is not the case. The last update from the Augusta safe house, saved on a holotape, has an agent recording the moment of attack.
My God. Listen, Augusta's not gonna make it. They're gonna be here any second. They knew exactly where we were.
Although the Institute isn't explicitly mentioned, they knew where we were can only be talking about the Institute, the only group actively hunting them down. Additionally, at least 2 Gen Synth bodies can be found in Augusta, showing that they took some casualties in their attack on the safe house. We aren't left with any other information, but it is likely that after the Institute took what they wanted, they left the safe house, where shortly afterwards a large raider group moved in and claimed the location. We have a vague idea of another location that is up near Parsons State Asylum, where a homestead became the home of a synth who had been mind-wiped by the railroad and settled down to have a nice life. The synth was known as Lambda 8, and she found a partner and tried to live a quiet life, but eventually the Institute sniffed her out. Lambda 8 was killed, and her wife almost died when a Courser team assaulted the homestead to reclaim Lambda 8. It was this event that convinced the railroad that they had to move runaway synths out of the Commonwealth. It was just too dangerous to try and let them start a new life within easy reach of the Institute. As far as what locations it could have been, Lynn Woods is the closest settlement near the asylum, but it has since been overrun by raiders. Across the river is Breakheart Banks, which is another settlement that has been wiped out and is a bit smaller than Lynn Woods, more of a homestead that was described. The settlers there have been recently wiped out by super mutants who now occupy the area. The last decent option is the Coastal Cottage, which is a small location where a pre-war house and garage is a home for a couple raiders and some Mirelurks who are hiding down in a cave. But we can't say for certain which of these locations Lambda 8 called her home. As an interesting and related note, this same terminal entry mentions seeing a courser with a small group of people leaving the Commonwealth. A railroad agent, only referred to as Watts, was mentioned as tailing the group, which seems to be Victoria Watts in Fallout 3, who was monitoring Dr. Zimmer and his courser companion Armitage all the way down to the Capital Wasteland. And sadly, that is all we can map. The railroad secrecy really works against us here, but these are the past headquarters and safe houses that we know of that have been destroyed. The first headquarters that we have any record of was destroyed by the Institute in 2266, approximately 20 years before the start of the game. The leader of the railroad at the time, named Agamemnon, what a name, died in the attack, and Wyatt took up the mantle, relocating the HQ to a different place. This second headquarters was destroyed in 2273, and Wyatt was killed in the attack, although the mysterious railroad companion, Deacon, was there and was able to help many railroad agents escape. Their new leader, Pinky, yes, you heard me right, Pinky, re-established a headquarters somewhere else, and in case you lost track by now, this is headquarters number 3 in less than 10 years. It was under Pinky's leadership in 2276 that Lambda 8 was found by coursers and killed up near Parsons, and later that year another safe house was raided by the Institute. The last straw for Pinky came in 2277 when a safe house called Trinity was destroyed, and Pinky willingly stepped down and let Desdemona, the leader of the railroad that we are familiar with, lead the group. Apparently there were no losses between 2277, when Trinity was lost, and 2281, which has to be some sort of a record. Desdemona records in a terminal that a location called The Farm was raided by the Institute and prompted the railroad to move headquarters to a location they called The Beast. I would bet that the farm was serving as their headquarters, although it isn't explicitly stated, and the railroad has a history of closing safe houses and shifting locations just to be safe. At any rate, 2281 was a very busy year, since after losing the farm and relocating the HQ to the Beast, an agent found the switchboard, the pre-war DIA base that we spoke of earlier. Another safe house was destroyed by the Institute, one named Mercer, which is very interesting because we will soon be discussing a new safe house that the sole survivor helped set up that is also called Mercer. When the Mercer safe house was compromised, they blew up the Beast and relocated their HQ to a new site that they called Bolt Hole. Apparently this was a good preemptive call because a group of coursers showed up to the Beast only hours later. So in 15 years, we have lost 5 headquarters, both willingly and unwillingly, and 5 safe houses. In 2285, the railroad relocated their HQ to the switchboard after Bolt Hole, quote, went down in fire. So it isn't really clear if it was attacked or left behind on purpose. The switchboard would finally be found and attacked by the Institute in 2287, not long before the events of Fallout 4. Not only did the railroad lose their headquarters and a number of agents there, but also 2 safe houses named Herkimer and Allen in a massive Institute operation, and it seems like Augusta as well. The only location of all of those that I just mentioned, which were 7 headquarters and 7 safe houses, what a coincidence, that we know the location of is the switchboard. Long before the railroad was even a glimmer in the eye of some synth lover, the US government constructed the hidden and fortified bunker that would come to be known as the switchboard. This bunker was run by the Defense Intelligence Agency, which is a reference to the real-world organization of the same name, who specializes in military and defense gathering efforts. One of their projects was the creation of the Predictive Analytical Machine, or PAM, which was a forecasting supercomputer that was meant to help the DIA prepare for future events like a world-destroying nuclear war. A railroad scout named Tommy Whispers discovered the facility, seemingly by random, and Tinker Tom, quickly moved his work and operations to the switchboard, likely completely unable to contain his excitement at what kind of crazy technology he would find there. The railroad would use the switchboard in various capacities, although it is not mentioned as being used as a safe house for synths, and this is where the railroad would convince Pam to join their cause. Rather than reprogramming her or writing some new personality subroutines, one of the longtime synth members of the railroad, known as Glory, spent some time alone with Pam, convincing her to help them. From that point on, Pam was on the side of the railroad and has been helping them primarily with trying to find the location of the Institute. The fact that a sprawling, fortified base, brimming with technology, was hidden so well in the quaint town of Lexington made it ideal for the railroad to use it as their headquarters, which they did after leaving their previous HQ, the Bolt Hole, behind. The switchboard would serve as their headquarters for nearly 2 years before the Institute would launch an all-out assault on the facility. Based on the number of railroad agent bodies still scattered around the facility, the attack caught them by surprise, and they suffered mightily at the hands of the Institute. The highest-ranking leaders were able to escape along with Pam, who would eventually make their way to the Old North Church and establish headquarters in the crypt underneath, guarded by a throng of ghouls who have made the church their home. Amongst the casualties of the switchboard, a special device simply called Carrington's prototype was left behind, and the sole survivor is tasked to go with Deacon to try and reclaim this tech that was left behind. The prototype looks like a modified stealth boy, and some sort of more powerful or longer lasting stealth boy would certainly be useful for the railroad and their synth moving operations. The switchboard is still occupied by a considerable number of synths who seem to be standing guard, milling about the offices and computer labs, chilling in the bathroom, and most importantly, a synth leader trying to hack into the terminal that grants access to a large vault. Inside the vault are the remains of Tommy Whispers, the original agent that discovered the switchboard, as well as Carrington's prototype. Taking out all the synths will lead to exiting the switchboard via an elevator that brings the sole survivor to a Slocum's Joe shop. This shop was a front for the switchboard that is currently guarded by synths. In the pre-war, this shop had peculiar troubles because its donuts and coffee were too good, drawing in more people than the DIA agents felt comfortable with, since more people around the entrance of a super secret facility just means a higher chance of discovery. Additionally, a railroad helper, or tourist as they are called, can be convinced by the sole survivor to help deal with the synths at the Slocum's Joe, either providing cover fire or rigging up a mini nuke explosive that is guaranteed to kill him when it detonates. We have mentioned the one location that we see the railroad lose after the beginning of the game, Ticonderoga. Ticon is a pre-war office building that the railroad agent known as High Rise is managing. The railroad uses the top floors and locks down the elevator and doors that lead to their section of the building. I already mentioned that this safe house only becomes accessible to the player if they are sympathetic with the railroad and can assist in the quest Boston After Dark, where a synth that was in Old Man Stockton's care was handed off to High Rise, and the sole survivor is asked to help escort the synth to the Ticonderoga safe house. Other than guns and bullets issue 5, there isn't much else beyond standard loot in the building, but later on in the game, the player will be asked by Desdemona to go and check on Ticonderoga as they have not heard from them recently. The sole survivor makes their way to the safe house, and upon going up the elevator are immediately confronted by a courser and a group of synths. That's not good. The courser will immediately interrogate us, and we can only talk him down by passing 2 increasingly difficult speech checks and convincing him that we are actually a part of the Synth Retention Bureau. That may stay the hand of this group of synths, but the automated turrets that the Institute repurposed for themselves will still target the player, and once they do, everyone will be hostile. Looking around on the top floor though, it is an absolute massacre. All agents and synths, it seems, have been killed, including High Rise, and this has become another fallen safe house. There's one more courser standing guard outside the building on the way out, and you'll most likely have to fight and kill him because of the gun turrets. This is an interesting encounter, because killing the coursers and synths will not negatively affect the sole survivor standing with the Institute for some reason, maybe because we left no witnesses. When the player informs Desdemona that Ticon was compromised and all hands were lost, she doesn't seem that upset. Maybe she's just desensitized to everything after so many tragedies, but losing this many safe houses so quickly in under a year should really worry her. Before I get to my population maps, which I always enjoy collecting the data on and creating the map for, it would make sense first to look at a map of all known recent railroad operations. By recent, I mean that they at least occurred just before the start of the game, so no historical operations that we scarcely know anything about will be shown here. Let's start in the south and work our way north. Diamond City is the most populous settlement in the whole Commonwealth, and due to that, the railroad has to have some kind of presence. The man of many faces, Deacon, can be found here dressed up as a Diamond City security guard when the player first visits the settlement. although he evades any direct questioning. Holotapes that call for people to stand up against the Institute by joining the Railroad are found in several places in the Commonwealth, and 3 of them are found in Diamond City, so there are subtle recruiting attempts going on here as well. Arturo Rodriguez is the arms dealer in the Diamond City marketplace, and appears to be working with the Railroad in some capacity, passing information along. This is only ever referenced in dialogue that will happen between Arturo and Deacon, where they do their call sign and talk about someone called the Article. Arturo mentions that the target keeps late hours with strange visitors, and when Deacon tells Arturo that that is hardly any sort of proof, he'll get defensive and exclaim that not even Piper has dug anything up yet. It seems pretty clear to me that the target is the one and only Mayor McDonough for a few reasons. The first is that McDonough has a history of communicating in secret with the Institute and Institute actors like Conrad Kellogg. Secondly, Piper has alluded to Mayor McDonough being a synth by comparing him to a tragic event that occurred 60 years prior. Now known as the Broken Mask Incident, it was when one of the first known Generation 3 synths to be sent to the surface went crazy in the Diamond City marketplace and killed a bunch of people. Piper says maybe they are making the same mistake assuming McDonough is a human like people did during the Broken Mask Incident. This has led to her getting shut out of Diamond City and led to considerable tension between Piper and McDonough. So Piper has been looking into the target, but hasn't dug anything up, and wrote an entire article insinuating the mayor is a synth. Lastly, Piper's words were printed in an article called The Synthetic Truth, and the first question Arturo asks is if Deacon is the guy about the article. So it seems the Railroad suspects McDonough of being a synth, which is alluded to by some Railroad agents remarking that Diamond City is under opposition control. That is the extent of the Railroad operations that we know for certain are taking place in Diamond City. Much like Diamond City, Good Neighbor is a major settlement with many people going in and out, and owing to its much more lax attitude towards rules and laws, things can get dicey. Deacon can also be found here in disguise, and more of the Railroad holotapes can be found here as well. The biggest operation that takes place here though is in the basement of the memory den. Dr. Amari is a scientist that specializes in the brain, memories, and how all of that interfaces with technology. We don't know much about her past or how she got affiliated with the Railroad, but while people can pay to live out their memories on the upper floor, the Railroad secretly transports synths to the basement, where they have their existing memories as a synth wiped and new ones implanted. This makes Amari and the memory den a key part of the Railroad and their process in successfully getting synths free of the Institute, and it's somewhat of a miracle that she hasn't been exposed. It's worth pointing out that she doesn't even know where the Railroad is. Agents just show up with synths. She wipes them, and then they take them as quickly as possible on their journey out. Waiting longer than necessary to move the synths out of the memory den exposes Amari to great risk, and she is the Railroad's only memory wiping specialist. Northwest of Good Neighbor, under the ruins of the Commonwealth Institute of Technology, is the science-obsessed Institute, hiding under mounds of earth from the rest of the world. Although they are so isolated, and no one but them knows where the Institute is, this hasn't stopped the Railroad from establishing covert operations there. This has less to do with how good the Railroad is at infiltrating groups and places, and more to do with just dumb luck, since all their Institute operations hinge on one person, Liam Benet, who is given the code name Patriot. Liam is a pacifist by nature and holds a belief that would have him reprimanded or exiled from the Institute if it was widely known. He believes Gen 3 synths are people, and as a result, has been helping synths escape from the Institute. Maybe this belief is partially the result of an experiment he and his dad are a part of, where a Gen 3 synth named Eve has been programmed to act as a wife of Alan Benet, the father of Liam. Alan and Eve. Maybe it's a combination of that and his dad's unorthodox beliefs that science should not be done without compassion and special consideration. His unique stance among the scientists in the Institute makes him a prime suspect for the synth escapes, even though he has nothing to do with them. Liam works in robotics like his father, and his position gives him the ability to form synth work groups, which gives him the opportunity to place synths seeking to run away on a project that leads them to the surface. He provides the synths with care packages, which include a map, instructions, and a coded holotape. Using this, the synths are able to cut a direct path to whatever destination Liam tells them to go. In the past, that destination was Diamond City, but there's also been the Mass Fusion Building, and most recently, Bunker Hill. Up to the point where the sole survivor travels to and makes contact with the Institute, Liam's efforts have not been in coordination with the railroad. He has just been giving synths that wish to be free a shot at life on the surface, hoping that someone would help the synths. The sole survivor is tasked with sending an encrypted message to Liam and establishing a meeting, at which point there is official coordination between the railroad and Liam's efforts. Liam, the sole survivor, and a synth named Z114 will begin formulating a plan to get 13 synths free of the Institute by putting them all in a work group and then staging a digging cave-in. Z1 will take this a step further and use the opportunity to have the synths, whose death that they will stage, be making weapons in secret. These weapons would be used to arm a synth rebellion within the Institute, but this armed conflict is something that Liam is not willing to consider at all. It is up to the sole survivor to decide which of the plans is chosen, and if they decide to create an armed rebellion, this conspiracy must go another layer deep in order to keep Liam from learning about it. Conspiraception. It isn't clear what the canon ending is for this questline, whether they only save the 13 synths or the armed rebellion helps in the destruction of the Institute, but the railroad itself prefers the latter option, as it helps them when they take the fight to the Institute during the nuclear option quest at the end of the game. Cambridge Church is just west of Bunker Hill and serves as an important location for Old Man Stockton to perform handoffs of synths to other safe houses, since Stockton is just a temporary receiver of synths. In the mission, Boston After Dark, we get a very good idea of what this process is like. The sole survivor is tasked with clearing out the Cambridge Church, which has a group of raiders that have decided to occupy the location. The raiders are new here, since Stockton tells the player that he has used this place many times in the past and would prefer to keep using it rather than finding a new place and introduce a bunch of unknown variables to an already tenuous operation. The sole survivor travels to the church, clears out the raiders, and waits in the church until midnight, having escorted a runaway synth known as H222 and lights a lantern in a window as a signal to the railroad agents. After Stockton leaves, the agent that runs the Ticonderoga safe house will arrive and ask the sole survivor to help him get the synth to the safe house. He has identified a number of raiders that are along the path to the safe house, and they need to be taken care of. The journey is not that long, but as predicted by High-Rise, multiple raiders have to be killed in order to slip by with H2. Having arrived at the safe house, High-Rise thanks the sole survivor, and the Ticonderoga safe house can be officially visited. It isn't clear if Stockton only uses the Cambridge Church for his handoff operations, or if he has several locations depending on which safe house the synths are going to, but Stockton does make it clear that this church is an important location. Northwest of the switchboard is an elevated highway where a railroad tourist, the term used for informants, can be found. The mission Tradecraft that sends the sole survivor with Deacon to the switchboard starts by finding Ricky and asking him for details related to the switchboard. Ricky has been spending a lot of time on the elevated highway, observing anything that might be of interest to the railroad, but has since been stuck up there when the Institute took the switchboard and fortified the Slocum's Joe. He is concerned he will be spotted if he tries to leave, and he has been waiting for railroad agents to come. He can be convinced to help deal with the synths that are at the Slocum's Joe store, and often dies trying to help. But Deacon and the sole survivor infiltrate the switchboard, kill remaining synths and the synth leader, and recover Carrington's prototype from the vault, resulting in the player getting one of the iconic legendaries in the game, the Deliverer. If Ricky survives the operation, he can sometimes be found randomly in Diamond City, or special encounters, still providing intel for the railroad. North and east, pretty far from the city of Boston, which has been the primary focus so far, is the Malden Metro Center, an interesting place that I have covered before in a few videos. A raider group, led by the Helter Skelter raider boss, has set up a base in the metro tunnels, but by the time the player arrives at the location, the raiders are in the process of being exterminated by a group of synths. The reason this is important to the railroad operations, however, is because the synths in this location are blocking the planned escape route for a synth, but not just any synth. H222, the synth that we helped in the Cambridge Church, has been transported to the memory den where he had his memories wiped and is on the last leg of his journey in getting exfiltrated somewhere outside the Commonwealth. The Railroad has identified the synth threat at Malden Metro and has requested that the sole survivor go to clear the area of synths so that H2 can make it out. Apparently, there is no better alternate route. When the sole survivor arrives there after being assigned the mission, Memory Interrupted, to their surprise, they will find Glory, another well-known railroad heavy, who has mistakenly been assigned the same mission. The duo will then sweep through the subway station and tunnels, all the way to the end where they will find a group of synths fighting the remains of the raider group. All the synths and raiders will need to be killed in order to complete the mission, and once the deed is done, Railroad leadership can be informed, and Dez will tell the sole survivor that H2 successfully made it out of the Commonwealth. Mission accomplished. The final operation on this map is the farthest north and east at Bedford Station. This operation did not end well, as the bodies of two people working for the Railroad, Dutchman and Helena, can be found there. Dutchman was meant to escort an escaping synth to this location, where a handoff would occur, and Helena would escort the synth outside of the Commonwealth. Helena was the runner, aka the one to get the synth the hell out of Dodge, and was waiting for Dutchman to arrive at midnight. Dutchman and the synth arrived at midnight, but Helena was late. They started to grow concerned, and Dutchman knew something wasn't right. A group of 5 people was seen coming towards them, and in an act of selflessness, Dutchman told the synth that the only chance of escaping was for him to run and draw the enemy's fire while the synth made a run for it. Dutchman would die in his attempt, just as Helena had died earlier, killed by the Institute coursers that set up the ambush. We are only left to speculate the fate of the synth, but at one point in development, Bethesda had intended for a much darker conclusion to this story. The synth, A9, would have been found dead, having taken his own life, rather than being taken back to the Institute. At any rate, this operation seems to have been a complete disaster, and it's still a substantial loss even if somehow A9 did actually escape and make it. Now, one operation that isn't shown on this map is the quest to establish the new Mercer safe house. After a few missions with the Railroad, Pam will give the sole survivor a mission to travel to a location, clear out any enemies, and build defenses until a defense rating of 10 or greater is met. The location is random and could be any of the settlements that the player can claim for the Minutemen. Shortly after completing the mission, some Railroad agents can be found occupying the Mercer safe house, but the game doesn't require any more interaction with this place. On to my favorite maps when I make these videos, which are the population maps. I feel like these really put things into perspective, showing where different groups' real strength in numbers lie. I went to each location where Railroad members can be found and counted them up, but again, because of the Railroad secrecy, we aren't presented with a whole lot. This number represents the number of Railroad agents to the nearest 5, unless there are 3 or fewer, in which case I just put the number observed. This is partially because numbers can vary game to game, so showing the exact numbers can be a bit misleading. Of the 4 locations that have Railroad agents on a permanent basis, the Railroad HQ has the most at 10, but that's not really a lot. The Ticonderoga safe house has about half that number, and all of these numbers are not including any synths that are just there taking refuge, since synths are constantly moving in and out of safe houses. Good Neighbor has only 1 member that is a known permanent resident there, Dr. Amari, and Bunker Hill similarly only has Old Man Stockton as its only permanent Railroad member. We know this is only a partial look at Railroad numbers though, because they are said to have a dozen safe houses in total, and an unknown number of agents undercover in those locations. So let's spice this up by showing the locations where dead agents can be found, which should give us an idea of how many Railroad members used to be there. Up north we have 2 dead agents at the Bedford station, Dutchman and Helena, from their botched operation. The switchboard, which was raided by the Institute not long ago, has about 10 bodies that can be found, although we do know more members were here, specifically the current leadership that were able to escape and relocate. That puts the total known population at around 16 if we count Pam. South and east we get the highest concentration of Railroad members in the whole game, live or dead, at the Augusta safe house. This safe house was hit by the Institute at the same time as the switchboard and has 20 members, which is shockingly high for a safe house. For comparison, Ticonderoga, which we see both before and after the Institute raid, has just over 5 railroad members, and that is a well-functioning safe house with a capable leader. Now, the only other population map that I can add to this is one that shows the number of known railroad sympathizers. They aren't members of the railroad, but they either act as informants, willingly look the other way when the railroad shows up, or otherwise believe in their cause. I'm not including Deacon in these numbers, who is seen in several locations doing whatever Deacon does. The Institute has one member that we mentioned before, Liam, who is sympathetic to the railroad and eventually starts working with them to free the synths. In Bunker Hill, we can overhear a conversation between Tony Savoldi, the local innkeeper, and his father, where he wishes to join the railroad since they are the only ones standing up to the Institute. Good Neighbor has 3 by my count, and let me tell you who they are and why I think as much. The first is Irma, who is the owner of the Memory Den and absolutely has to know Dr. Amari is helping mind wipe synths in the basement. She has no problems with synths, as shown by her flirtatious conversation with Nick Valentine, who is hers, yours, and our robo-crush. The second person is Hancock, and maybe you could say Fahrenheit as well, since they are so close. This is because a Join the Railroad holotape can be found in his personal room on a table, which is not where you put a holotape that has a message you disagree with. Additionally, Deacon will outright state that Hancock willingly looks past any and all railroad operations in Good Neighbor. The last person that I think is sympathetic to the railroad here is Cleo, the friendly, gun-selling, thirsty Asoltron. A holotape can be found on the second level of her shop, where it is easily found. Again, not something you just leave in your personal space unless there is something there. The fact that she is an Asoltron that likes to be spoken to and treated like a human means it could make sense that she would be attracted to a group that might oblige her. Diamond City is the last place where we have good evidence of railroad sympathies. Arturo Rodriguez, the weapons merchant I mentioned before, only shows his association with the railroad because of his conversation with Deacon, and he seemingly functions as an informant and lookout. Becky Fallon runs the clothing store called Fallon's Basement, and she has a Join the Railroad holotape on the shelf in the upper floors. The second holotape is in the personal room of Vadim and Yafim at the Dugout Inn behind a locked door. A third person, Abbott, is known for his work keeping the wall, known as the Green Monster, painted. Inside Abbott's personal dwelling is another railroad holotape. We know there are more railroad agents, sympathizers, and dead agents as well, but this is the extent that we know for sure. But if you know some references to other people that may be sympathetic to the railroad that I missed, let me know in the comments. Since we are talking about these Join the Railroad holotapes that can be found all over, let's look at how many can be found and where. I split these up into 3 groups. Holotapes that are left in public places in the hopes that people passing through will listen to it and seek them out. The second group are those that are in a prominent place in someone's personal space, which hints that they are interested or sympathetic towards the railroad, and I will get to the third in just a moment. Starting in Diamond City, there's a holotape on a nightstand at the Dugout Inn inside Yafim and Vadim's personal quarters, meaning that they might be sympathetic. Abbott has a tape in his own home, clearly visible on a shelf when you enter, so he's probably interested in them as well. Becky Fallon has a tape on a shelf upstairs in her clothing store, and this seems to be her personal holotape because she hates the Institute, accusing them of having abducted her husband, so it would make sense that she might seek out the railroad. Good Neighbor has one holotape in a public space, the ladies' restroom at Hotel Rexford, and then one in possession of Hancock, who is confirmed to be sympathetic to the railroad, and another in the second story of Cleo's shop that I also interpret as her being an ally. Bunker Hill has only one, and it is left on a counter in the marketplace, so that one is just generically placed in the hopes that people will listen to it, possibly by Stockton himself. Now, the last 2 locations where these tapes can be found are interesting because they only have this third group of tapes that we haven't seen yet. These are tapes that were in possession of someone or a group that dislikes the railroad and disagrees with the message. How can we tell this? Well, take Covenant as an example, which has exactly one such holotape, but it is found in a trash can. It is not on some counter where people can easily find it and listen to it. It's not in a house on a table where an ally of the railroad can listen to it or show close friends. It's in the freaking trash can. I don't think I have to explain my reasoning with this too much. The final location that has only this third group of holotapes is the Institute itself. Yes, that is right. These tapes have somehow made it to the Institute, and not just 1 or 2, but 4. I actually find the presence of these tapes really interesting because they are not randomly distributed or held in the locker at the Synth Retention Bureau or something like that. All 4 tapes are found in the living quarters of 3 people: Dean Volkert, who is the Institute physician, Clayton Holdren, who is the Director of Bioscience, and Isaac Carlin, who is a scientist whose focus is primarily on plant research. That means the only 3 scientists who are named in the Bioscience division all have a holotape, and Carlin has 2. Bioscience is the only division with scientists who have these in their possessions. But this isn't some secret plot, since every single holotape is in a trash can. This begs some questions. Why do only the bioscience scientists have these? How are these getting into the Institute? Why does Carlin have 2 of them? The best I can figure is that they are being brought into the Institute by synth salvage teams that bring all railroad-related items back to the Institute to be analyzed. They are in the personal rooms of these individuals because they were curious. And maybe these tapes get passed around to people who want to listen to them for themselves, where they get promptly thrown away. But I can't really reason why only the bioscience scientists have these, and why Carlin has 2 of them. I would really love to hear your thoughts. There are a number of Radiant quests that can be assigned by the Railroad that I want to map out here, because seeing them from a bird's eye view leads to some interesting discoveries. The first is the quest Weather Vane, which is given by Tweaker Tom, where he tasks the player with installing some atmospheric sensors, which he calls Myla, to try and detect any Institute terraforming attempts, because he thinks the Institute is altering the atmosphere. To test this theory, he wants to gather data and ask the player to place these Myla units in 11 different locations shown here. Most of these locations are quite tall, like the Hub 360 building, the Corvega assembly plant, and the Cambridge construction site. Since they don't know where the Institute is, it makes sense that they didn't concentrate these sensors around CIT, but there could have been more even distribution throughout Boston. And the tallest buildings in the game, Trinity Tower and Mass Fusion, aren't even considerations. One would think the tallest locations would be important for measuring atmospheric conditions, but hey, what do I know? It is also worth noting that Tom will also say that Mila units have a camera that can be used to feed Pam data, and he tells the player that he installed these at the request of Desdemona, who wanted greater surveillance on the Freedom Trail. In that light, if you look at their current holdings, these would provide pretty good coverage for that purpose. Some of these would be able to see the Freedom Trail, but a lot of them wouldn't. But all in all, this might allow for greater monitoring and security. Pam will give a few missions for the Jackpot quest, which is where she has determined the location of a pre-war DIA cache and sends the sole survivor to recover the supplies that are hidden there. There are only 3 locations, and curiously, 2 of them are right next to each other, so it kind of looks like there are only 2 locations. Pam will send the player to the Medford Memorial Hospital, Hub 360, and Pinnacle High Rise, of which the latter 2 are very close to each other. Having 2 so close almost makes me think that those buildings were associated with the DIA in some way, but there's absolutely no evidence for this outside of these quests. Once the player has established the new Mercer safe house, a railroad agent known as Caretaker will give the sole survivor some locations that need to be cleared in order to clear the way for a synth to be exfiltrated from the Commonwealth. Although the Mercer safe house location is not static and can be any potential settlement, the places that need to be cleared are always the same 7 locations. Here, shown in blue, are all the locations. And I don't know about you, but I see a pattern. If these locations are needing to be cleared in order to allow a synth to get out, I see a trend line from east to west. We know that the Memory Den is one of the final places that synths go to before being escorted to safety, and the quickest way from Good Neighbor to the edge of the map is west. Now, that doesn't mean that it is the safest place for synths to go, but to me, it just makes a little too much sense. Why would these locations need clearing if they are moving synths north or south? This pattern seems to make something that at least resembles a cleared path. Pam will also give the player a mission called Variable Removal, where the sole survivor is tasked to travel to a location and kill a courser, which has been seen there. Most of these locations are where the Institute has previously attacked or would have attacked if the railroad hadn't stopped them, although there are notable mentions like the Reeb Marina, General Atomics Factory, and Watts Consumer Electronics, but check out my Institute Cartography video for a more in-depth look there. The last of the Radiant quests that the Railroad will give the player are to the mattresses, which have an interesting premise. After the fall of the Institute, the next biggest threat to synths is a raider group called the L&L Gang, who have taken it upon themselves to seek out and kill any synth that they can. These are all the potential locations where the gang members can be found at, although you will only ever visit 6 of these locations. These are the bulk of locations that just raiders in general can be found at, which also means that these L&L members can be found in rival gang bases. So this isn't a normal raider gang that is completely allegiant to one raider boss. This is reinforced by Desdemona, who says that the gang is a loosely affiliated group of raiders that take sadistic pleasure in finding and executing synths. Apparently these guys are pretty good at what they do, because Des even says that the railroad has lost more synths to them than coursers, which I find low-key hilarious. 6 drugged up raiders are better at finding synths than the ultra-futuristic institute with robotic bird sentries. All I have to say to that is it's so great to see a group of people put differences aside and work together. Just don't ask what it is that they're working on. When any of the major factions take control of the Commonwealth, they will man a series of checkpoints around the map, and the railroad is no exception. I think it could be argued though that they are the least equipped of all the factions to even man these checkpoints in a militaristic faction to keep the peace, since they have been so secretive for so long that some people aren't even convinced that they're real. So the last map I wanted to make in this heckin' long video is to give an idea of what the process is for a synth that is running away from the Institute. And we will use the synth H222 as our example, since we know more about his journey through this process than any other synth. So the very first step is for the synth to come from wherever the work group that they were able to escape from was assigned on the surface, and they make their way to Bunker Hill. Old Man Stockton says that right now, Bunker Hill is the first stop for all synths. So when Liam Benet sends synths out with their maps on a holotape, he is directing them to make their way to Bunker Hill. So these yellow arrows just denote a number of different directions the synths could potentially come from. The synths will then be picked up by Stockton, or maybe some other railroad agents, and sheltered below the settlement in a secret safe house. Stockton will then work with either HQ or one of the number of safe houses that the railroad has that can shelter synths, because he cannot let synths stay too long at Bunker Hill, likely because he can only accommodate so many synths before blowing his cover. He mentions one of his favorite places to do such an exchange is the Cambridge Church, and he personally escorts the synths to that handoff location. It is likely that there are more than one handoff locations, depending on which safe house the synth is meant to go to. A railroad agent will rendezvous with the synth at the handoff location and escort the synth to a more long-term safe house. As time permits, the synths are then transported to Good Neighbor, where they can get mind-wiped, and as Dr. Amari states, they shelter there for some time, recuperating from the invasive memory replacement procedure. H222, after undergoing the procedure, is just waiting in the basement, and even though he has no memory of the sole survivor, he left a holotape thanking us for our role in helping him escape the Institute. While the synth recovers, the railroad plots their route out of the Commonwealth, trying to minimize the dangers as they do so. In H222's case, he is escaping northward, since the sole survivor is tasked with wiping out a group of synths that are apparently in the way at the Malden Metro Center. Destroying that threat then allows for H222, with the assistance of a runner, which is railroad speak for a member who escorts the package out of the Commonwealth, to leave, most likely to the north, since we know where he is starting in the memory den and where the threat needs to be eliminated at Malden Metro. We don't know how far they have to travel before they are considered safe, but they likely have to travel a good ways, and the farther, I'm sure, the better. And that is the final map. I would really like to hear your thoughts, comments, or corrections. Thank you for being here with me. And a special thank you to my patrons and YouTube members who go the extra mile to give me support. I am happy to welcome Exiled Blood, Wade Wilson, RMP, and Kai to the ranks of Adams Devoted. And if you like what I do and want to show support, it is always appreciated in whatever form that takes. Embrace the glow, brothers and sisters. Take care of yourselves and each other. We all have a special place in Adam's kingdom, and I'll see you soon.